Imagine a country where people officially worship thunder, where the ruler prays before a wooden idol with silver mustaches, where merchants with swords choose their gods like they choose trade routes. And now, imagine that just a few decades later, this same country becomes Christian, reveres martyrs, and builds stone churches. This isn't fiction. This is Russes at the end of the 10th century. The Christianization of Russes is not just another date from a school book. It's a civilizational turn, the result of diplomacy, blackmail, personal ambition, and a clever game with empires, a decision that shaped the language, culture, and alignment of an entire region for the next 1,000 years. And perhaps it wasn't made for faith at all. Subscribe to our channel if you enjoy slow, deep stories where history isn't boring chronology. It's a drama with gods, emperors, and schemes. And tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it right now? We're always curious to see which corners of the world our listeners join us from. The 10th century, the word Rus didn't mean a country in the modern sense. It was more of a network, not a line on a map, but a system of connections, trade, politics, dynastic ties, and spiritual allegiances. Much like we say the West or the global North today, Rus was shorthand for the elite who lived along major river routes and controlled people, tribute, and deities. This Russes had no stone churches yet. Its spiritual landscape was shaped by sacred groves, ritual stones, riverside altars, and wooden idols, crafted to resemble either humans or something more terrifying. If the Christian God was singular and omnipresent, the gods of Russes were many, tangible, and deeply local. The idol of Perun stood atop a hill in Kyiv, wooden-bodied, silver-headed, golden-mustached. It's hard to say whether he protected the city or held it hostage. The territory of future Rus was home to many tribes: Drevlians, Severians, Polians, Krivitians, Slovenes, Vyatikians. These weren't just ethnic labels, but local communities with their own structures, rituals, and sometimes entirely different ideas of who was in charge. Before centralized rule emerged in Kiev, these tribes operated independently and often clashed. The Drevlians, for instance, weren't keen on paying tribute, which ended badly for Prince Ihor. He was killed by being tied to two bent trees that tore his body apart. Later, his widow Olha arrived to negotiate. With fire, vengeance, and cunning diplomacy, like any good saga, few gods, lots of blood, a dash of politics. At first glance, the paganism of Russes seems chaotic. Many gods, many customs, no central doctrine. But in reality, it was a practical belief system, one that gave answers to specific needs. Thunder and lightning, that's Perun, god of war and the skies. If it thunders, he's angry. Offer a sacrifice. Fertility, family, domestic peace, that's for Makosh or Veles, one a female deity, the other protector of cattle and wealth. Misfortune in the village, a curse, or someone broke a ritual. This system worked because it was embedded in daily life. A walk into the forest required an offering. Building a house called for a ritual. Childbirth involved incantations. Paganism wasn't separate from politics or economy. It was politics and economy. When a prince ordered idols raised in a city center, it wasn't just religious. It was a show of control. Everyone could see which gods the ruler worshipped. Everyone knew who now held cosmic authority in the region. It was less like proclaiming faith, more like hoisting a national flag. Trade routes didn't just shape Russia's economy, they shaped its identity. On one end, the Baltic and Scandinavia, on the other, Byzantium. A Kiev merchant might speak multiple languages, recognize Greek coins, and trade in Arab silks. Rus' was not isolated. On the contrary, it was a hub through which goods, slaves, ideas, and religions flowed. Scandinavian Varangians, whom later chronicles called the Rurikids, introduced notions of princely rule, military hierarchy, even the idea of a contract between ruler and ruled. Their understanding of power differed from the tribal model. They weren't religious missionaries, but their presence planted the seeds of centralization, a prerequisite for any sweeping reform, including Christianization. At the same time, Byzantium was the nearest superpower. Its gold, crosses, and icons held enormous prestige. Rus' attacked Constantinople more than once, sometimes with swords, sometimes with gifts. Every time, it was about asserting sovereignty. Religion in Rus wasn't merely a matter of belief. It was a tool of internal legitimacy. A prince didn't need divine revelation. He needed a shared language of authority. And gods served that purpose. By choosing which deity to elevate, the ruler established not only spiritual order, but political hierarchy. This made paganism flexible, but also vulnerable. It had no sacred texts, no centralized clergy, no institutional memory. Rituals shifted from village to village, and religious loyalties were often more local than national. Paganism worked well in a tribal, decentralized world, but it struggled to compete with religions that came equipped with state infrastructure. Because Christianity and Islam brought more than gods, they brought books, laws, clerical hierarchies, schools, and, most crucially, imperial endorsement. They offered not just salvation, but governance. And for a prince aiming to rule over a diverse, sprawling territory, there wasn't just theology. It was a political gift. And that gift became increasingly visible with every diplomatic mission, every trade exchange, every Greek monk who wandered north. Christianity, particularly in its Byzantine form, was especially attractive because there the emperor wasn't just a ruler, he was God's representative on earth. That kind of political theology was an irresistible lure for a Kyiv prince who wanted to be more than just the strongest. He wanted to be the only legitimate one. But even before Christianity arrived in full force, Rus' was already demonstrating religious fluidity. Gods were added, repositioned, even fused. In Kiev, Prince Vladimir launched a pagan reform around 980, organizing a state pantheon and elevating Perun as the chief god. It was a political attempt at religious unification. Ironically, it helped pave the way for something even more centralized, Christianity. So when the new faith came, complete with temples, priests, and imperial symbolism, the soil was ready. The old gods had believers, but no bureaucracy. The new God had structure, scripture, and an army of missionaries. And that, perhaps even more than personal conviction, explains why a religious revolution took root. Christianity didn't appear in Rus out of nowhere. It didn't fall from the sky like one of Perun's lightning bolts. It seeped in slowly, whispered to merchants, intrigued noblewomen, built quiet churches on the southern borders, and occasionally arrived bound and bruised with captured Greek bishops. If paganism was the dominant way of life, Christianity was that stranger in the port, first feared, then mocked, and eventually invited to dinner, The story of Christianity on the territory of future Russes begins long before the official baptism in 988. Early references go back to the 4th, 5th centuries, when the southern edges of what would become Russes were part of a contact zone between Rome, Byzantium, and the so-called barbarian tribes. Christian communities existed in Crimea during late antiquity. In Chersonesus, a city with ancient Greek roots, Byzantine bishops were already active by the 8th century. And it was there, 2 centuries later, that Vladimir would come to be baptized. But that's for another chapter. Meanwhile, Christianity lived like a mycelium underground in trade, military campaigns, and dynastic marriages. It didn't yet have temples in Kiev, but it had found believers among the princely retinues, merchant families, and skilled artisans. A few decades before Vladimir, Russes was no longer purely pagan. It was pagan on the surface. One of the clearest signs of this underground Christianity was Princess Olha, widow of Ihor, mother of Sviatoslav, and grandmother of Vladimir. She entered history as a ruthless avenger of her husband's death, but also as the first Russes ruler to adopt Christianity officially, personally. Olha's journey to Constantinople around 957 wasn't just a diplomatic mission. It was political acrobatics. The widow of a pagan, mother to a military warlord, arrives at a Christian empire, is baptized by none other than Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos, according to some sources, and changes nothing back home. Yes, Olha was baptized. But Rus? No. Her son Sviatoslav remained a staunch pagan. According to some accounts, he even refused baptism to avoid embarrassing himself before his warriors. In the language of old-school politics, losing face with your army was worse than angering the gods. Still, Olha's move was strategic. Her baptism marked Russes as ready, or at least willing, to integrate with the wider civilized world. She was signaling, "We can play by your rules. If needed, we'll wear the cross." And that message was heard. In Constantinople, in Poland, and in Bohemia. After Olha, Christianity continued to operate in the shadows. It still lacked the strength for open preaching in the main squares of Kiev, but it gradually embedded itself into the fabric of Rus life. Through trade, wherever there was a Greek merchant, there was a cross around his neck. Through diplomacy, where there was a marriage alliance with a Christian princess, there was often a clause for a chapel. Through war, as even among prisoners there were priests who carried books, rituals, and the subversive idea of a single God. Southern towns in Crimea played a particularly important role. These were zones of constant contact with the Christian world. In Chersonesus, an ancient city under Byzantine control, Orthodox churches had been operating since at least the 9th century. In nearby Sugdea, medieval Theodosia, Christianity was so widespread that even some local Khazars practiced it alongside Judaism. It was a religion that could coexist peacefully, but also had the potential for expansion. Crimea was one of the main channels through which Christian influence entered Rus. Greek missionaries traveled there, and Rus's princes visited the region seeking alliances, baptism, or advantages. In this context, religion functioned like diplomatic currency. The cross could be purchased alongside imperial support. What about Cyril and Methodius? These two brothers, Slavic apostles, educators, translators of the Bible into Church Slavonic, are typically associated with the great Moravian kingdom, present-day Czechia and Slovakia, but their influence extended beyond that region. While there's no direct evidence they came to Russes, they created a tool that would later prove critical, a language for Christian preaching that Slavs could understand. You could say that Cyril and Methodius didn't bring the cross to Rus. They made it possible for the cross to be accepted as native. Without Church Slavonic, Russes might have received the Greek rite untranslated, and faith would have remained the domain of foreign elites. Thanks to their work, Christianity could speak the language of future Kiev scribes. In addition to princely households privately embracing Christianity, there were genuine islands of faith. Sometimes these emerged around foreign communities, Greek, Armenian, Khazar. Other times, around monasteries or churches built with a prince's permission. One such example is the wooden church of St. Elijah in Kyiv, mentioned in the primary chronicle in the year 944. In Novgorod, Polotsk, and other major towns, Christian communities also appeared, often near merchant quarters. Cities that lived by trade were always the first to adopt new things, and new gods arrived alongside new coins. For the princes of Rus, Christianity wasn't just a faith, it was a diplomatic tool. If a pagan marriage was sealed by an oath to Perun, a dynastic alliance with a Christian power often required baptism, at least formally. It was part of the deal. To ignore it was to risk losing support. In this way, Russes gradually became entangled in a broader international game, where religion was part of grand geopolitical strategy. Across Europe, baptism had long been a kind of currency. Rulers converted to gain titles, recognition, trade privileges. Russes didn't want to be left behind, especially as its neighbors began to convert. Poland adopted Christianity in 966. Hungary followed soon after. Bohemia, Moravia, Croatia, already in the game. If Russes remained pagan, it risked isolation, and that meant loss of political influence, trade difficulties, and diplomatic marginalization. Even though the Russes' elite had no particular issue with their gods, they clearly saw the world was changing. The old system of tribal sacredness couldn't offer what the cross now promised: legitimacy, allies, literacy, schools, architecture, Byzantine artisans, and a future. Interestingly, Russes didn't resist Christianity with fanaticism. There's no evidence of mass persecution of Christians before Vladimir's reforms. There were no Rus inquisitions or public burnings. On the contrary, Christians seem to have coexisted within the pagan order relatively peacefully, sometimes respected, sometimes mocked, but rarely eliminated. This can be explained in part by the structure of Rus itself. Before Vladimir, it was a sprawling but non-centralized network. The prince held power, but not absolute authority. In one city, idols might be erected. In another, a church permitted. Everything depended on trade, alliances, and the mood of the retinue. This tolerant pagan anarchy allowed Christianity to grow without open war, and at the same time, it prepared Russes for the moment when a choice would have to be made: public, final, and official. By the 980s, Russes was already living in a state of religious drift. Christianity was inside, in letters, in customs, in personal baptisms. But it had no central structure. The faith was private, sometimes fashionable, but not official. It was in this context that Prince Vladimir began his political game with the gods. Before converting to Christianity, he launched a pagan reform, establishing a pantheon in Kiev, building a central shrine, naming Perun as chief god. It was paganism's last chance to become a state religion. But at the same time, it proved something else. Russis was ready for a major transformation. It wasn't just looking for faith. It was looking for a system that could explain the world, unite its people, and legitimize authority. And that system was already knocking at the door. In the 10th century, there was no such thing as a single, abstract Christianity. There were Christianities, plural: Roman, Byzantine, Armenian, Syriac, Coptic, Georgian, each with its own rituals, languages, authorities, and even calendars. Belief in Jesus didn't mean a unified view of God, power, or society. So when Prince Vladimir chose whom to invite to baptize Russes, he wasn't just making a religious decision. He was deciding which civilization his state would belong to. In that sense, choosing Byzantium seems logical. But it didn't appear logical right away. That choice was the result of decades of observation, contact, defeat, and triumph. Diplomatic, commercial, and ideological. Because Byzantium wasn't just a state, it was an empire with a capital E. It set the tone, the style, and the symbols for much of the known world, and Russes, pagan or not, could not ignore its grandeur. In 988, when Vladimir baptized Russes, Western Europe was only beginning to recover from centuries of invasions. Franks, Goths, Saxons, and Norse were still trying to piece together a coherent legacy from the ruins of the Roman Empire. But in the East, Rome still existed. Byzantium saw itself as the direct heir to Rome, complete with its architecture, bureaucracy, titles, and imperial dignity. In Constantinople sat the Basileus, king of kings, not just a ruler, but a sacred figure anointed by God. To the outside world, Byzantium was more than a country. It was a school of empire, a university of geopolitical thought. If you wanted to learn how to rule, you went to Constantinople. Byzantium didn't just produce silk, icons, or engineering. It produced a model, and that model was eagerly copied by Bulgaria, Serbia, Georgia. Now it was Russes that stood at the gates. To Byzantium, Russes was both intriguing and dangerous. It wasn't viewed as entirely barbaric, rather as a people not yet mature. Byzantine chroniclers often described northern nations as children to be guided, instructed, but not feared. This was classic imperial optics. Neighboring states were potential students, and Constantinople was the teacher. This imperial tutoring wasn't just ideological. It had a practical dimension. Byzantium actively exported orthodoxy as a tool of influence. Conversion to Christianity meant entering the empire's orbit, accepting its calendar, church hierarchy, and ultimately its political authority. The cross signaled submission, but also recognition. At the same time, Russes was neither a subject nor a vassal. It was a partner with teeth, a trading power, a military force, sometimes aggressive. Russes' war bands visited Constantinople more than once, sometimes bearing gifts, sometimes fire. In 860, for example, Russes launched a major assault on the Byzantine capital. The attack was so sudden that the emperor had to appeal to prayer, and the citizens turned to the Virgin Mary. It was not just a war, it was a performance. We're not just neighbors, we're players. After every such clash came a response: embassies, treaties, crosses, promises. Russes didn't lag behind. It played by the rules of high politics. The 911 treaty between Prince Oleg and Byzantium is one of the most detailed international agreements of its time. It regulated not only trade but crime, the division of spoils, even inheritance rights, for Russ's people within the empire. All these contacts, peaceful and violent, reinforced one idea. If you're going to adopt a new faith, take it from the most prestigious Christian power, not from the Latin West, not from wandering missionary tribes, but from the source that embodied both imperial grandeur and sacred tradition. Byzantium's greatest asset wasn't just its religion, it was the model in which that religion functioned. In Byzantium, church and state weren't separate. They operated in what would later be called a symphony of power. The emperor wasn't merely a secular ruler, he was a guarantor of the faith. The patriarch wasn't just a spiritual leader, he was an ally of the throne. The whole system ran like a synchronized machine, altar, crown, and army in harmony. For pagan Rus, where the prince acted as chief, judge, and priest all at once, this model felt familiar, but far more refined. It didn't just offer sacral authority, but also justification for that authority. Not, I rule because I'm strong, but I rule because I'm chosen and anointed. It gave political legitimacy, something Russes sorely lacked in the eyes of other states. The marriage to a Byzantine princess, which Vladimir would later secure, was the pinnacle of that legitimization. Byzantine princesses did not marry just anyone. Such a union was equivalent to diplomatic recognition. If the empire allowed you to marry a Porphyrogenit, a princess born in the purple, then it acknowledged you as an equal. For Vladimir, this wasn't merely a marriage, it was a diploma in high global politics. Rus' was no longer northern barbarians, it became a peer to empire, and Christianity was the price he paid for that status, but also the tool that made that status possible. And that, ultimately, is why Rus' chose Byzantium over Rome or other Christian centers. Latin Christianity offered faith. Byzantium offered faith plus imperial style, history, ritual, law, architecture, chant, all came as a package. It wasn't just a religion, it was a civilization that carried the aura of grandeur and a blueprint for how to attain it. In 986, Prince Vladimir summoned a council of boyars and elders. There, he announced, the Bulgars have come to me, urging me to accept their faith. The Germans came too, saying the same. The Khazars came. The Greeks, each offers, each promises. So begins one of the most famous episodes from the primary chronicle, the story of choosing a religion, as if Rus were a bride and the world's religions had lined up to propose. This scene has long become part of the national myth. It's elegant, dramatic, symbolic, and very convenient. It presents Vladimir as a rational, pragmatic, and far-sighted ruler who chooses not blindly, but after thoughtful deliberation. It's like a historical Tinder, with each religion having its own profile. But was the scene historical? Did delegations really arrive one after another like contestants on a royal casting show? Could a pagan prince really speak so openly about rejecting Islam, dismissing Judaism, and choosing orthodoxy simply because of the beauty of the church chants? First, we must understand that the primary chronicle is not a transcript of real events. It was written more than a century after the baptism, within a Christian milieu, and with a clear agenda to show that the choice of faith was free, deliberate, and correct. In the chronicle, the Muslim delegation is rejected due to Islam's ban on wine. The Jews, because they lost Jerusalem and were punished by God. The Catholics, because their service isn't beautiful. The Greeks win. thanks to both stunning churches and true faith. This account doesn't reflect real theological debate. It reflects the logic of the chronicler to portray that the prince chose the right faith among false ones, and that he did so not by coercion, but through intellectual inquiry. It's an apologetic, not a historical record. If we set aside the poetic framework of the chronicle, let's try to imagine how events might have unfolded in reality. By the 980s, Russes was already in contact with all the major monotheistic religions, with Islam through Volga, Bulgaria, a Muslim state and trade partner, with Judaism via the Khazar Khaganate, whose elite practiced Judaism, with Latin Christianity through embassies to Germany and Poland, with Orthodoxy via Byzantium, Crimea, and Greek missionaries. Each of these religions wasn't just a belief system, it was a vehicle of international integration. To adopt a faith meant entering a club. Along with baptism came embassies, marriage alliances, architects, books, bishops, and new titles. Islam, an alliance with the south, but no wine. Volga, Bulgaria, one of the region's earliest Muslim states, may well have proposed an alliance to Vladimir. Chronicles mention a Bulgar mission to Kiev. Their offer carried weight. Islam held authority, strong trade networks, and imperial backing from the caliphate. But Islam also came with constraints: strict asceticism, prohibition of wine, polygamy, and tight religious discipline. For a prince whose authority rested on his warband, feasts, and displays of generosity, this posed a cultural conflict, not because wine mattered more than faith, but because wine was part of the social glue. Judaism, an elite religion, but without a state. Judaism, meanwhile, had strong intellectual prestige, especially within Khazaria, where the ruling class practiced it. But for Vladimir, it was too isolated. The Khazar Khaganate was already in decline, taking the weight of the Jewish option with it. Moreover, Judaism lacked a missionary agenda at that time. It was a religion of communities, not of imperial expansion. For an ambitious ruler, it looked like a road to nowhere. Catholicism was also a serious contender. The Holy Roman Empire was strengthening its hold over Central Europe. Polish Duke Mieszko I had already adopted Latin Christianity in 966, and by 974, so had the Hungarians. Through Poland, Latin missionaries had reached Russes, bringing books and trying to persuade the prince. But the West came with a different vision of Christianity, one with a strict hierarchy, allegiance to Rome, and a claim to universality. In the Catholic world, the king is a servant of the church, not its master. The Pope has the power to crown rulers and to revoke legitimacy. For Vladimir, who was in the process of building a centralized state, this posed a risk: to choose a faith that granted authority, but might take away independence. Moreover, Latin Christianity lacked the aesthetic appeal that Eastern Orthodoxy displayed. In the primary chronicle, this is rendered simply as the German service was unattractive. But there's more to it. The Eastern liturgy wasn't just prayer. It was theater. Icons, incense, chant, architecture. All of it captivated even a pagan observer. The Byzantine version of Christianity combined sacredness with imperial structure. Faith in God did not challenge the ruler's authority. It sanctified it. The emperor in Constantinople didn't answer to the church. He was its earthly head. This was exactly what Vladimir sought: a religion that didn't restrict him, but legitimated his rule. Orthodoxy also had powerful aesthetic and cultural appeal. According to the Chronicle, Vladimir's envoys, upon visiting Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, said, "We didn't know if we were in heaven or on earth." This may be fiction, but it captures a truth. Orthodoxy overwhelmed. It didn't just persuade, it enchanted. After all the deliberation, assessments, and diplomatic contacts, the choice was made. Vladimir turned to Byzantium, not with a plea, but with a demand. The empire at the time was in crisis. A power struggle was underway in Constantinople, and co-emperors Basil II and Constantine needed military support. Vladimir offered it in exchange for a marriage to their sister, Princess Anna. This was an unprecedented move. Byzantine princesses never married foreigners, especially not pagans. But the situation was desperate, and Vladimir knew it. He seized Chersonesus, a Byzantine stronghold in Crimea, essentially forcing the empire to choose marriage or war. Basil VI agreed on the condition that the prince be baptized, and so came Vladimir's personal baptism. Some sources say he converted in Chersonesus right before the wedding. Others claim it happened after his return to Kiev. But one thing is clear. Baptism was part of a grand bargain, not a moment of spiritual awakening. Anna was not just a bride, she was a symbol of alliance, and the faith, the legitimization of that alliance. Once the prince had been baptized, a new phase began. What had been a personal act now became a state project. To baptize Russes meant changing its rituals, its structure, its elite, its very notion of power. But this could only begin once the top had embraced the cross. Thus came the year 988. The prince ordered idols torn down, the people of Kiev baptized in the Dnipro, churches built. A new chapter began, one made possible only because beforehand there had been a trade in gods, with a stake not just in belief, but in the future of the state. By the late 980s, Russes was already 1 foot into the Christian world. But what happened next wasn't a spiritual awakening or a merciful sermon. It was a deal. Formally, perhaps on parchment, but essentially at sword point. Because to receive faith from Byzantium, Prince Vladimir did what he always did when he wanted results. He took what he needed and offered it as leverage. In this case, the city of Chersonesus, a Greek fortress in Crimea, the empire's northern pearl. Why did Vladimir want Chersonesus? There are a few reasons. First, it was a symbolic and strategic point, a city with a Byzantine presence, with churches, trade, and bureaucracy. Whoever held Chersonesus spoke to the empire not as a beggar, but as an equal. Second, it was a bargaining chip. Byzantium was in internal turmoil. Basil II, one of the empire's co-emperors, was embroiled in a bloody struggle for the throne. He needed help, and Vladimir offered it, not for free. He ordered his forces to march on Chersonesus. The city was well fortified, but the prince knew how to pressure, not just with blades, but with offers. Some locals surrendered, some fled, others opened negotiations. And just like that, Vladimir was no longer merely the Prince of Rus. He now controlled a key to Byzantine prestige. Princess Anna Porphyrogenita was the youngest sister of Emperor Basil II. Her name literally means born in the purple, meaning her father was already emperor at the time of her birth. That wasn't just a descriptor, it was a status. Such women never married non-Greeks, no marriages with barbarians, no exceptions, until Vladimir. That the empire agreed to this marriage wasn't just a concession, it was a historic precedent. Constantinople was acknowledging Kiev was not a colony or a frontier post, but an equal partner, not just a faithful Christian, but a potential ally to rely on in times of crisis, even if it meant giving up something precious. For Anna, marriage to Vladimir was a tragedy. Chronicles say she wept and begged her brother not to force her. But politics outweighed emotions. With the princess came clergy, bishops, priests, icon painters, scholars. Rus wasn't just receiving a woman of imperial blood. It was receiving a Christianization kit, pre-packed and shipped. The moment of Vladimir's baptism is one of the most mythologized episodes in all of Rus's history. The chronicle dramatizes it. The prince goes blind, then regains his sight after baptism. A clear nod to the Apostle Paul, a literary formula for spiritual awakening. The point isn't the event, but the message. The prince sees the truth only through baptism. In reality, it likely happened differently. Vladimir was baptized as part of the political agreement with Byzantium, likely after the terms of the marriage were settled. He became a Christian not because he found truth, but because it gave him access to a higher level of the game, a civilizational upgrade from mighty barbarian to sanctified monarch. The ceremony, according to some sources, took place in Chersonesus. The wedding with Anna happened there too. And it was there that Vladimir publicly signaled his transformation. He now belonged to a different, elevated world. It was a ritual of metamorphosis, like a cinematic scene where the hero walks through fire and emerges changed. When Vladimir returned to Kiev, he was no longer the man people had known. He returned not only with a wife of imperial blood, but with a new face of power. His sword was now consecrated, his title confirmed by God, his city chosen for a new order. That's why what followed happened with such force. Idols were toppled, the people of Kiev baptized en masse, churches built one after another. This wasn't just a religious campaign. It was a revolution of symbols. Kiev had to see. Everything had changed. When Vladimir returned from Crimea, he didn't hold a referendum on introducing a new religion. He didn't organize public debates with the pagan priests. He didn't ask the opinion of the Polians, Drevlians, or Novgorodians. He simply gave the order. The Christianization of Rus wasn't a gradual conversion like in medieval Ireland, where monks traveled from village to village, preaching and building schools. Nor was it like the Roman Empire, where Christianity became the state religion after centuries of persecution. In Rus, it was an act of state will, carried out with the same decisiveness as any military campaign. The baptism of Kiev. The most famous scene is the mass baptism of Kiev's residents in the Dnipro River. According to the chronicle, Vladimir commanded all the townspeople to come to the riverbank, enter the water, and there, under the prayers of Greek clergy, the mass baptism took place. It sounds romantic, but in reality, it was an act of immense administrative and symbolic power. Not showing up meant opposing the prince, and that meant opposing the new regime, which could cost you not only your soul, but your property, your status, even your life. The mass nature of the event was likely a radical gesture. This is the new Rus, and this is who we now are. It wasn't just spiritual cleansing. It was a demonstration of power, like a parade, like a manifesto. The baptism of the capital was only the beginning. Kiev was the heart of the state, but not its border. Beyond lay Novgorod, Polotsk, Rostov, Chernihiv, Vladimir, the lands of the Drevlians and the Severians, the Slovenes, and the Tverci. And everywhere it played out differently. In Novgorod, for example, the baptism was far from peaceful. A local pagan priest and part of the population resisted. Idols were destroyed and citizens fought back. A famous episode tells of the idol of Perun being thrown into the Volkhov River, and, according to legend, it floated upstream, as if refusing to disappear. The baptism there was enforced. Vladimir had to send his son Yaroslav with an army to ensure compliance with the new law. Persuasion didn't work. There was no time to convince. Only submissions remained. In other regions, the process was calmer. Where princely power was weaker and elite resistance less organized, Christianity spread slowly but without bloodshed. It was accepted as a new language of authority, a new order, a new route to social advancement. Because accepting baptism didn't just mean saving your soul, it meant gaining a position, access to princely administration, a place in the new system. And many took that opportunity. Christianity in Russes didn't entirely erase paganism. The old beliefs lived on for decades, in some places even centuries, in forests, in villages, in incantations, rituals, and seasonal festivals. But at the state level, the cross triumphed. With the victory of Christianity, the old pagan priests lost their influence, the Volkovs vanished from the chronicles, and the names of the gods disappeared from public rituals. In their place came new elites, Greek bishops, Kiev metropolitans, clerics, scribes. They became the new carriers of power and authority. Along with them came literacy, because liturgical books were needed, administration, because the church required records, courts, and archives, schooling, because someone had to be able to read the Gospels, new names, because now it was not Perun, but Peter, not Veles, but Basil. Why the experiment survived, it might have been expected that after Vladimir's death, the old faith would return, that the people would say, "We were only pretending." But that didn't happen. Christianity remained, and not only remained, it expanded, because it didn't just bring a new religion. It brought order, international recognition, administrative tools, connection to empire, a framework for culture and law. Russes received not just churches, it received a new structure of reality, and that structure proved strong. Vladimir's sword had imposed it, but it turned out to be convenient for princes, profitable for elites, intelligible to cities, and eventually acceptable even to peasants. It wasn't merely endured, it was gradually embraced. The baptism of Russes is often portrayed as a spiritual triumph, an awakening, an illumination. But in truth, it was an act of power, diplomacy, negotiation, and deep state transformation. Vladimir didn't become a saint because he was gentle. He became a saint because he changed reality. He took a harsh pagan world and embedded a new matrix into it. Churches instead of idols, books instead of spells, gospel names instead of spirits. But he didn't destroy the old world completely. He simply taught it to live by new rules. Russes did not become Christian overnight, and not completely. But it entered a world where faith was part of a grand game, geopolitical, cultural, symbolic. And in that game, it found a seat at the table. One might debate whether the cross should have been imposed by the sword. But history doesn't ask for permission, it simply moves forward. And what began as an act of force would later become a source of culture, literacy, law, and statehood. And in the end, perhaps Vladimir's strongest alliance wasn't his marriage to Anna or his conquest of Chersonesus, but the alliance he forged between the sword and the book. Because that is what created the Rus we remember and still believe in. Thank you for staying with us through this deep dive into one of the most pivotal and paradoxical moments of medieval history. If you enjoyed this journey, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more slow, thoughtful, and richly layered stories. And tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it now in your part of the world? We're always curious to know where history reaches.